Long ago, it seemed that evil was everywhere, all around, and very real. Often, evil stalked the earth in animal form, demonic beasts with supernatural powers, children of the devil. Yet many of those beliefs survive in the modern world. People are still haunted by those ancient animal devils. Human imagination can transform the natural world into a place of terror and dread. Witches seem to cackle from the undergrowth, and ghosts to scream from the branches. Evil takes on animal form, companions to witches or consorts of the devil. The roots of these fears lie deep in the human psyche, with their origins in humanity's far distant past. And by the medieval period, a whole menagerie of animals were associated with evil. Europe in the Middle Ages, a time when evil was thought of as a tangible force, a time when those with secret knowledge of black magic and sorcery could bargain with the forces of evil for wealth or power. And a sorcerer's ultimate goal? To call up the ultimate personification of evil, to make a pact with the devil himself. This medieval devil is part human and part animal, with animal features from beasts that lurk in humanity's darkest nightmares. Following a sorcerer through his ritual to conjure up the devil will reveal why these creatures have come to symbolize evil. But understanding the reasons behind these associations needs help from modern experts, drawing on disciplines as widespread as biology and history, culture and mythology. John Matthews, an expert in shamanism and animal deities. Caitlin Matthews studies Celtic mythology and early religions. Ronald Hutton, a historian interested in the evolution of religious culture. Stephen Harris, a zoologist specializing in mammals and their relationship to people. And Helmut Braul-Tuchel, a historian particularly interested in the medieval period. As the sorcerer gathers together the different elements to create the devil, he starts with the devil's most dramatic feature, his wings. And the wings of the devil are those of a bat. Because bats have been feared for centuries. An ancient association with evil, but even today many people react to bats with fear and loathing, as Professor Stephen Harris often encounters.
People dislike bats because of their appearance. First of all, they're very small and people tend to associate them with mice. They've got large, naked wings that make them look rather scaly almost to some people. And they've got very interesting and intricate faces, very large ears and a number of adaptations around the face, often protuberances and folds of skin that to some people make them look ugly.
But these features that seem so grotesque to humans are vital to the bat. They focus the pulses of sound that guide the bat through the darkness. A bat builds up a picture of its world by listening for the echoes of its high-pitched screams. Before people understood how a bat can fly in total darkness, the only explanation was supernatural power. And a few species of bat seem even more sinister. In South America, some bats use a heat-seeking infrared sense to find their warm-blooded prey. Blood-sucking vampire bats, so similar to the old-world legends of blood-sucking vampires, the undead. Is this why some people see bats as evil? But vampire bats weren't discovered by Western society until fairly recently, and even the vampire legend is only a few hundred years old, as Professor Braal-Tuchel explains.
Der Vampir, wie wir ihn kennen, wurde von Romanschriftstellern.
The vampire, as we know it, was created by writers and scholars in the middle of the 18th century. They combined bits and pieces of different traditional tales and created a modern myth.
Mythologist John Matthews.
Of course, in the early stages of the vampire myth, the association with bat wings was not there. The first person to introduce this idea seems to have been Bram Stoker himself in his famous story Dracula. This probably comes about because at that point the first reports had come back from South America of actual vampire bats.
So even in the modern world of science and reasoning, culture, even fairly recent culture like film, can shape people's fear of nature. Even though the true nature of bats is now well understood, they're still hated because, like the vampire, they play on a fundamental human fear. They're creatures of the night. With such limited night vision, humans see any creature at home in the dark as supernatural. Owls, like bats, hunt at night, in silence. And again, all over the world, they're omens of ill fortune or death. But unlike bats, owls do use vision to fly in the dark. A tawny owl's huge eyes can see in light levels undetectable by humans. Yet owls need some light to see. They can't fly in complete darkness. Their eyes are only twice as sensitive as human eyes. So a tawny owl prefers to hunt on moonlit nights. It twists and turns at speed through a tangle of branches. And an owl is helped by its exceptional three-dimensional memory, remembering different routes through the trees. Another skill that seems magical to humans. Ghostly, eerie, supernatural. Yet bats and owls are no threat to people. Humans label them as evil because of that ancient biological fear of the dark. But the night conceals other creatures that have always invoked terror, and still do. Creatures that perhaps humans are right to fear. Well-organized, well-armed, pack hunters, wolves. In Europe and Asia, people have feared wolves for so long that truth and imagination have blurred and mingled. And it's not always clear which is fact and which is fiction in some images of wolves from history. Historian Professor Ronald Hutton.
Something that gets built into the myth of the European wolf is the idea of the pack in full pursuit of fleeing human beings. And it's from Russia the staple image comes, that of the troika careering through a forest at night with a wolf pack in full cry behind it.
These are images from deep in the human imagination. Images that reflect a deep fear and loathing buried in folk memory. Images that emerge as stories like Little Red Riding Hood, where a wicked wolf pursues an innocent child. But Red Riding Hood is just a story. Its image of the wolf more fiction than fact. Healthy wolves hardly ever attack people. In fact, they usually leave humans well alone. Even so, wolves have killed people, though not in the way of the folk image, not a snarling pack attacking a helpless victim lost in the forest, but something far more deadly. Professor Stephen Harris explains.
One of the reasons people particularly feared wolves was rabies. Rabies was a particularly unpleasant disease. It was a horrible death. You died in spasms, but it was clear that people's mind was still active. They were aware of the suffering they had, and there was no cure for it. Certainly, rabid wolves could kill a lot of people. There is a record of a rabid wolf entering the town of Carmarthen in Britain in 1086. That bit 20 people before it was killed, and most of those people died of rabies. So individual wolves could sometimes kill a lot of people.
But even rabid wolves are rare, and healthy wolves are no real threat to people. So where does this deep hatred of wolves come from?
To a historian of Europe, it's pretty plain that wolves are no real danger to adult human beings, but they are a scourge to livestock. And all this gets worse as agriculture spreads and human beings eat into the wolves' natural environment. And so, with good reason, for an ancient peasant society, the wolf is the terror that lurks on the edge of the wood.
Howls echoing through the forests, a sound to fill a farmer with dread. Yet early farmers weren't intimidated by wolves. They had a weapon of their own. From as early as 300 BC, evidence shows that the Iron Age farmers of Europe, the Celts, were breeding large dogs, wolfhounds, just to hunt down and kill wolves. And Christianity, with its symbolism of God as a shepherd, reinforced the wolf's association with the devil. From then on, the war against wolves escalated. In 800 AD, the Emperor Charlemagne founded an order, the Louveterie, dedicated to wolf killing. In other parts of the world, wolves are seen very differently. Professor Stephen Harris.
The situation in the New World was somewhat different. And the people of North America, the native peoples, actually are not scared of wolves. In fact, quite the opposite. They revere them, they have folklore about them, they hold them in high regard.
Strong family ties and selfless cooperative hunting. Native Americans tried to copy these wolf qualities, saw the wolf as a creature to admire, not to hate.
And that's because the native peoples of North America actually don't have many livestock. The native peoples were hunters, they lived at low densities, they didn't reduce the native populations of game in the same way that people did in Eurasia, and ultimately they didn't compete with the wolves.
But elsewhere, the hatred of wolves remained intense. So intense it must run deeper than just the fear of a large predator. The wolf is hated because it's a symbol of the dark side of human nature. A symbolism so ancient, people can't see past this image to the truth behind the fiction. As the great American wilderness writer Aldo Leopold said, "We've chosen the wolf to embody everything we dislike about ourselves." And Little Red Riding Hood, written in the 16th century, wasn't just a tale about a hungry wolf. It was a morality tale. Those early writers already used the wolf to symbolize humanity's evil nature. Yet even in Europe, wolves weren't always hated and feared. Long before the Celts, about 15,000 years ago, Europeans lived, like Native Americans, by hunting, and they kept no livestock. Wolf pups were even taken into human settlements, where the wolf's social behavior fitted perfectly. And from that ancient relationship, the dog was created, the oldest domestic animal, man's best friend. And from that wolf ancestor, people bred endless different forms, many as working dogs, many others just as companions. The descendant of the wolf has been tamed, domesticated, at the command of humans. But sometimes the old fear of wolves resurfaces in a different form. Demonic black dogs.
After the wolves had been more or less exterminated or driven out throughout most of Europe, having rid ourselves of that fear, it was as though we had to replace it with something else. And it's mostly from this period onward that you start getting stories about huge black dogs that follow you home at night and tear you to pieces, black dogs with great gleaming eyes that will lead you astray into bottomless bogs.
And Lucifer's right-hand demon, Mephistopheles, appeared as a huge black dog when he visited Faust in the German story from the Middle Ages. As Faust read his Bible, the aspect of the dog grew more and more terrifying. Black dogs, it seems, are consorts of the devil himself, because black, the color of night, is also the color of evil.
This
Many creatures that are black are labeled as evil. And for some of these creatures, their lifestyle reinforces this belief. The raven, an ancient symbol of death and decay, for reasons explained by Caitlin Matthews.
Very many people associate the raven with evil because of its nature, because it feeds off the dying, it feeds off dead, it feeds off carrion flesh, which is a thing which is abhorrent to human beings.
But this dark image is only a small part of the raven's character. Ravens are bright, intelligent birds as a result of their lifestyle. They eat a vast range of different things. Scavenging from carcasses is only one way of finding food. They also dig up insects, steal other birds' eggs, or eat fruit, or frogs. The list seems endless. And a young raven needs to learn how to exploit all these different sources of food. Once fledged, they still try to beg from their parents, but now their parents hardly ever respond. Instead of feeding their young, they start looking for food themselves. Young ravens will try anything they see their parents trying, and quickly learn what is edible and what's not. This ability to learn stays with them all their lives, since new opportunities arise all the time. And in the past, ravens learned that humans were the best providers. Ravens gather when an army is marching and fly towards the sound of battle. The ancient Celts honored a goddess of death and battles, the Morrigan. She often took the form of a raven, always present on the battlefield.
The Morrigan is one of 3 Irish goddesses who appear as a triplicity. She is the Morrigan, she is also Bov, and she is Mocha. And these 3 are seen in the vicinity of battlefields, especially after the battle is done, when they fall upon the bodies and they scavenge them. The Morrigan with her sisters very often appears in the form of a crow or a raven, because these are the birds that are seen most often preying upon the dead upon battlefields.
The raven, as a symbol of battles and death, has taken a central role in many of the great stories of Celtic mythology, stories which reinforce the bird's negative image. For example, the raven, sometimes as the Morrigan herself, is woven throughout the tale of the greatest of all Celtic warriors, the Ulster hero, Cuchulainn. With his superhuman strength, Cuchulainn conquered all his opponents in combat. But then the warriors of Ulster fell prey to an ancient curse, a curse that inflicted the pains of childbirth when they were most needed to fight. But not Cuchulainn. Immune to the curse, he defeated the whole enemy band single-handed. So his enemies used stronger magic, and eventually Cuchulainn felt the touch of the goddess of death. Even he would fall, and his flesh become nothing more than food for the Morrigan, the raven. His enemies mortally wounded him with enchanted spears, but even as he sensed death approaching, Cuchulainn, the warrior hero till the end, wanted to face the enemy standing. He strapped himself to a standing stone, and none dared approach.
But then the raven settles upon the pillar stone, upon the shoulder of Cuchulainn, and people begin to realize that indeed he is dead. And it is the Morrigan herself who comes and claims him at the last.
Myths like this reinforce the raven's dark symbolism. Its associations with death and decay have followed it for millennia. Very different side to its character. Ravens are one of the few creatures that seem to play as adults, rolling and tumbling on the wind as if for pleasure. An aerobatic display, part of the raven's courtship display in spring, as a pair match each other's movements as they fly. But even outside the breeding season, ravens can't seem to resist playing in updrafts around cliff faces. Some cultures respond more to this playful image of the raven than to the symbolism of death. These people don't see the raven as wholly evil. They see it as a combination of good and evil, a mixed blessing, a trickster. The Northwest coastal Indians tell the creation story of how Raven brought light to a dark world by stealing the sun from an old man who kept it hidden in a box. So to Native Americans, Raven was a light bringer and, like the wolf, often a force for good and not evil. Sometimes a creature's image can change dramatically over history, even within the same culture, as happened to the one creature that most people label as evil. The snake. Once a symbol of fertility, rebirth, and healing for cultures right around the world. But something happened to change that view, as Caitlin Matthews explains.
The snake, of course, comes into its own in the book of Genesis, where it tempts Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat.
For eating from the tree and gaining knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve suffered banishment from paradise and became mortal.
And so the serpent is seen as being the one by which death came to humanity, the one who brought death to the human race.
And for causing the fall from grace of God's finest creation, the serpent too was punished.
And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life.
The serpent was originally seen as more like a dragon, but cast down upon its belly, later writers identified it with a snake, and then associated the snake with the devil, the tempter of Eve. In this way, the snake changed from a symbol of healing and renewal and became part of the familiar image of the devil. But there's more to this fear of snakes than taking the blame for the biblical fall of mankind. For some people, snakes induce sheer, blind terror, a phobia. It's possible that these fears could originate as far back as humanity's evolutionary origins. Certainly our nearest relatives, chimps, also panic at the sight of a snake.
If a python or a snake is seen in the jungle, the chimp group will surround it, they'll be hollering, they'll be screaming, they might throw sticks at it. They show a great aversion to a snake because potentially to them it is a life-threatening animal.
Snakes can produce the same frenzied panic in some people.
This basic fear of snakes almost certainly goes back to the time when we ourselves were living in habitats very similar to the chimpanzees of today, and snakes posed a great threat to us.
They induce utter terror in some people, but very few spiders are dangerous to humans. So where do such irrational fears come from? One theory suggests that spiders became associated with disgusting conditions, particularly in the early Middle Ages. Any creature thriving in filth and decay evokes a strong loathing, even today. And then, in the 14th century, death began to carry away people in their millions. The Black Death. And according to some, spiders were one of the creatures responsible. But even before the plague struck, people all over Europe were afraid of spiders. They thought that the harmless bite of a tarantula would cause dementia, only curable by sweating out the evil in a dance, the tarantella. something so devastating, so overwhelming as the Black Death could have deepened the fear of spiders so much that it was passed down the generations. A cultural transmission of an irrational fear. And an irrational fear is the very definition of a phobia. Blaming spiders for the Black Death may have been irrational, but people were desperate for an explanation, since, as Ron Hutton explains, they had no idea of what was happening to them.
If we have trouble explaining what plagues are now because of the lack of forensic evidence, people had even less hope then, but they did their best. A favourite explanation was that it came out of the air, which in view of the fact it's spread by viruses and bacilli is not a bad guess, and it's especially associated with foul smells, dirty places, stinks, with some reason because they are genuinely unhealthy, they're where germs breed. Another explanation was that it was carried in some way on animals. And because bubonic plague is spread by fleas, this has some good sense behind it again. The trouble was they had no idea which animals. They're more likely to kill cats and dogs than they are to kill rats, for example, and it's black rats that carry bubonic plague.
With no cats and dogs, no predators, black rats thrived. And it was fleas on the black rats that were the real culprits, carrying the deadly plague bacteria. But since this was unknown, people tried all kinds of ways to ward off the disease. They tried to make foul air more wholesome with scented flowers, to no effect. It's thought by some that the children's rhyme, "Ring-a-ring-a-roses," dates from the plague, the pockets full of posies being used to sweeten the air. But even though they weren't seen as carriers of the plague, rats were still reviled. Where there are people, there are rats, scavenging on discarded waste, thriving in disgusting conditions, taking advantage of human success. It seems that people don't like nature when it competes, multiplying out of control. And directly or indirectly, rats have killed more people than any other mammal. At the time, they never understood they were being killed by fleas, insects. Yet even in the Middle Ages, some insects were seen as in league with the devil. Some parts of the Bible refer to Satan himself as Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. Originally, Beelzebub was a Philistine god from an area close to Jerusalem, so it's not surprising that such a pagan god was demonized and equated with Satan. But it's not clear how he became associated with flies. Beelzebub was probably a sun god, and with the sun came flies. Or perhaps flies swarmed around his sacrifices in the heat of the Near East. Either way, since flies swarm around rotting meat and disgusting conditions, it's a natural link to see their alien image as both evil and devilish. Some animals have been labeled as evil through their association with the devil, but others gained their sinister reputations through different associations. Associations with other practitioners of evil, such as diabolic old women using black magic, witches. It was believed that witches could turn into certain animals, shape-shift, to move through the countryside unseen. Other creatures, familiars, were thought to be in league with witches. But how did these creatures fall into such bad company? Ronald Hutton.
The reason why particular animals are chosen as likely witches' familiars stems from two quite different sources. One is they're simply the kind of household pet that old ladies have around and are therefore associated with them, like cats and rabbits and mice. White mice were rare and rather spooky, so they were favourites for the stereotype of witches' familiars. But second, most specifically, witches' animals are those that stare. Because one of the most widespread human emotions is a fear of the evil that's conveyed by a glance, if looks could kill, and many people think they could. The evil eye in operation. And an animal that stares, that eyeballs you in a way that other animals don't, is particularly spooky. And that's why owls, cats, and hares are the animals really closely associated with witchcraft.
But the hare's evil associations go back even further than this.
This animal seems to have been very much associated with the goddess Eostre, whose name gives us the name Easter and the Easter festival.
Hares are linked with this ancient pre-Christian goddess of the spring because their wild antics are very obvious at this time of the year. Hares behave like this through most of the summer, but by late spring, the grass and crops have grown tall enough to hide them. All these crazy antics are the Mad March hare's way of courting and breeding. One evil symbol survives all society's changes, survives throughout the centuries, as potent today as ever. The devil's most recognizable feature, horns.
We're used to seeing the devil portrayed with horns, but in fact the idea of a horned god or a horned being of some kind goes back almost as far as we can see in recorded history.
Humans painted the first images of horned men onto the walls of caves in Europe around 10,000 years ago.
And these are said to represent the first images of the shamans or magicians who used this kind of sympathetic magic, possessing the qualities of the animal to help in the whole matter of the hunt.
But even as human civilization evolved, horns remained as important symbols. Deer shed their antlers and grow new ones each year, so horns came to symbolize growth and renewal. And as the stags used their antlers in the rut to fight for the right to mate, horns also came to symbolize virility and wild nature.
From then on, references crop up, particularly in the Celtic tradition a great deal, to the idea of a horned god.
A very well-known image comes from a cauldron found in Denmark, a horned figure surrounded by wild creatures and holding a snake, itself a symbol of renewal. The church relegated all these ancient gods, labeling them as devils. But the devil himself doesn't wear the antlers of a deer. He wears the horns of a goat, an ancient association with evil. In biblical times, villagers ceremonially heaped all their sins onto a goat, a scapegoat, and drove it into the desert, where their sins, and probably the goat, perished. But the horns of the devil don't originate from the scapegoat. They do belong to an ancient pre-Christian horned god, but one particular god that became the most familiar thanks to classical education.
Come the 19th century, when the educated people of Europe are having Greek and Latin flogged into them at school, Pan, the Greek horned god, becomes the one they all know about. He is the ideal, custom-made, pagan god, the symbol of all that's natural and virile and carefree and loving and summer of love and happy. But he's also the one who becomes the symbol for the Christian devil. Until then, the devils appeared in many forms. From the Victorians, the devil becomes a natty gentleman with a goatee beard, goat's horns, and hooves. He is, in fact, Pan. and the Christian devil changes form to match the new ideal pagan god.
This image of the devil, made up from aspects of animals that we hate or fear, shows how our relationship with the natural world has changed. Biology, culture, mythology all play a role in selecting the animals that we label as evil. But the animals themselves are not evil. There is no evil in nature. Only one species, our own, has evolved moral judgment, has acquired the knowledge of good and evil.
Wir haben im Laufe der Zeit eine ganze Reihe von Einsichten gewonnen, die uns das Böse.
We've learned a lot over the centuries to explain evil, but we no longer need the old stories of evil to explain bugbears, such as diseases, misery, and death. But progress has not extinguished evil. We are far from getting rid of it.
It's easy to see why, in the past, ignorance bred fear. But in conjuring up that ancient devil, it seems that nothing much has changed. Today, the natural world and the human mind are understood better than ever before, yet fear can still overcome reason. But perceiving animals through the lens of our irrational fears diminishes our whole view of nature. Sophisticated, rational, educated. Yet the modern mind can still be haunted by those ancient animal devils.